On January 15, 1919, at 12:40 in the afternoon, the city of Boston experienced what remains to this day one of the most absurd disasters in recorded history. A wave of molasses, 25 feet high and moving at 35 miles per hour, exploded through the streets of the North End neighborhood and killed 21 people. That sentence is completely true, every word of it. Let's talk about how it happened. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company had a tank. It was not a small tank. It was 90 feet in diameter, 50 feet tall, and held 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses, the raw material used to produce industrial alcohol, which at the time was highly profitable due to wartime demand. The company had built this tank in 1915, quickly and cheaply, in the middle of a densely populated Boston neighborhood, because in 1915 that was apparently a fine thing to do. The tank had problems from the start. Workers in the neighborhood reported that it leaked constantly, so constantly that local children would scrape molasses off the side of the tank with sticks and bring it home. The tank groaned, it creaked, it had been patched repeatedly. The company's response to complaints was essentially to paint it brown so the leaks were less visible. On January 15th, temperatures in Boston had climbed unusually quickly. It had been a bitterly cold winter, but that day the temperature jumped from 2 degrees Fahrenheit overnight to 40 degrees by midday. The molasses inside the tank, which had recently been replenished with a fresh 2.3 million gallon shipment, began to warm and expand. At 12:40 p.m., the tank gave up. The explosion was heard across the city. Rivets shot out of the tank like bullets. Witnesses described a sound like machine gun fire, then a low rumble, then a roar. A wave of molasses between 8 and 25 feet high, the estimates vary depending on where you were standing and how fast you were running, surged through the streets at a speed later calculated at roughly 35 miles per hour. 35 miles per hour. For context, the average human sprinting speed is about 15 miles per hour. You were not outrunning this. The wave demolished an elevated railway support structure, lifted a fire station off its foundation, derailed a freight car, and swept through the neighborhood with a force that knocked buildings off their foundations. The Boston Post described the scene as a terrible brown mass that consumed everything in its path. 21 people died. 150 were injured. Horses were trapped in the sticky flood and had to be shot by police because there was no way to free them. Rescue workers, firefighters, and Red Cross volunteers waded through molasses that in some places was 2 to 3 feet deep and still warm. People who fell into it could not get up. The suction of the cooling molasses held them down. It took weeks to clean up. The molasses seeped into the harbor, turning Boston Harbor brown for months. Cleanup crews used saltwater hoses, sand, and eventually gave up on certain areas entirely. Locals reported the smell of molasses in the North End on hot summer days for decades afterward.
Now, the lawsuit. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company immediately blamed anarchists. This was 1919, and anarchist bombings were genuinely a thing at the time, so the claim was not entirely implausible on its face. Their theory was that a bomb had detonated inside the tank, and they stuck to this theory with impressive confidence given that there was essentially no evidence for it. The resulting civil case became one of the longest and most significant product liability cases in American history. More than 3,000 witnesses were called. The proceedings lasted 6 years. An auditor named Hugh Ogden reviewed the evidence and concluded in 1925 that the tank had been poorly constructed, improperly tested, and inadequately maintained. He found that a company engineer had signed off on the tank's construction without bothering to do the math on whether it could hold its contents. The company was ordered to pay out approximately $600,000 in damages, about $10 million in today's money. The disaster quietly became a turning point in American product liability law. It established that companies could be held responsible for negligent construction of industrial infrastructure, and that "we think someone else did it" was not an adequate defense when your poorly built tank full of 2 million gallons of molasses had just destroyed a neighborhood. There is a historical footnote worth mentioning. Some engineers and historians have studied the structural failure in detail and noted that the tank, by every reasonable calculation, should not have been approved. It was thinner than it should have been, it was never properly tested, and when a test fill was done with water, the water was colored brown, reportedly so that leaks would be less obvious. The company knew it leaked, they tainted it. There is also, for reasons that historians have not fully explained, a persistent local legend that on particularly hot summer days in Boston's North End, you can still smell molasses in the streets. Testing this claim is left as an exercise for the listener. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 was a preventable disaster caused by a company that prioritized speed and cost over the basic structural integrity of a 90-foot tank full of 2.3 million gallons of liquid in the middle of a city. 21 people died, horses were shot, the harbor turned brown, and the company blamed anarchists. Boston cleaned it up, took the company to court, won, and then apparently decided the appropriate memorial was to make the story sound as unbelievable as possible so that future generations would struggle to take it seriously. It worked. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.